Somewhere in a barn in rural Pennsylvania, sitting in a wooden tool chest that has not been opened in 15 years, there is a handsaw that could outcut anything you will find at a home improvement store today. Not because it is special, not because it was expensive, because it was built during a period when the companies making handsaws competed the only way they knew how, by making the steel better, the teeth sharper, the plate thinner, and the handle fit your hand like it grew there. That era is over, and it has been over for a long time. What replaced it is a wall of brightly packaged saws with hardened teeth that cut reasonably well for about a year and then get thrown in a bin because nobody can sharpen them, which is exactly the outcome the manufacturer was hoping for. $7 for a new one, $0 for a file, and 30 minutes of your time. The math is not complicated once you see it clearly. The 7 saws on this list were built before that model existed. They were built to be resharpened, reset, tuned, and used for another generation. Half of the names on this list you will recognize immediately. The other half you have almost certainly never heard of, and that gap in your knowledge is worth examining because it is not an accident. Before the countdown starts, you need to understand one thing about handsaws that the modern tool market has gone to considerable lengths to make sure you never think about. A handsaw is not complicated. It is a plate of steel with teeth cut into one edge and a handle attached to the other. The variables that separate a great saw from a mediocre one are actually very few. First is the plate itself, the quality of the steel, how flat it is, and whether it is taper ground, meaning the plate is thicker at the toothed edge and gradually thinner toward the back. That taper is expensive to produce, and it is the reason a quality saw glides through a cut without binding, needing almost no set in the teeth to keep it tracking free. Second is the tooth geometry, the specific angles filed into each tooth that determine whether the saw is designed to rip along the grain or cross-cut across it, and how aggressively it removes material versus how clean it leaves the surface behind. Third is the handle, the way it positions your wrist relative to the plate, and whether it allows you to push the saw along a natural arc without fighting your own arm. Those 3 things, plate quality, tooth geometry, and handle fit, are the entire conversation. Everything else is decoration. And here is why that matters right now. The modern hardpoint saw, the kind sold with the brightly colored handle, and the claim that the teeth stay sharp 3 times longer than traditional saws, is specifically engineered to make that conversation impossible. The teeth are hardened to the point where a file skates right off them. When they dull, and they do dull, your only option is replacement. There is no taper grinding on a $5 disposable plate. There is no hand filing to restore the geometry. There is no relationship between you and the tool that extends past the moment it stops cutting the way you need it to. The 7 saws on this list represent the opposite of that philosophy, and once you hold one that has been properly sharpened and set, you will understand immediately why serious woodworkers never stopped looking for them. Number 7. The Spear and Jackson Handsaw. In the United Kingdom, Spear & Jackson is not a hidden name. The company was founded in Sheffield in 1760, which puts it in operation before the United States existed as a country, and it has been producing edge tools continuously in some form ever since. In Britain, the brand carries the weight of 2.5 centuries of production. In America, it is largely invisible, which means you can find vintage Spear and Jackson saws at estate sales and flea markets for a fraction of what comparable distant examples sell for, simply because American buyers do not immediately recognize what they are looking at. The vintage production, particularly the cross-cut saws made through the middle of the 20th century, features beautifully finished plates with a taper that you can feel the moment the saw enters the wood. The handles on the best examples are carved beech or apple wood, shaped with a subtlety that only becomes obvious after you have used one for a few hours and realize your wrist has not fatigued the way it normally would. The lesson built into number 7 is the same one this list will return to repeatedly. Geographic invisibility is not the same thing as quality invisibility. A saw built in Sheffield, England, with 260 years of production knowledge behind it, did not become a lesser tool the moment it crossed the Atlantic. It just became a bargain. Number 6, Harvey Peace. Say that name to most American woodworkers, and you will get a blank look in return. Say it in a room full of British antique tool collectors, and watch the room change. Harvey Peace was a Sheffield toolmaker producing saws and edge tools through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And the examples that survive are among the most finely finished hand saws ever produced in England. The plates are extraordinarily flat, the result of a level of handwork in the manufacturing process that modern production economics make essentially impossible to justify. The tooth filing on the best examples is so precise that collectors who study these things under magnification consistently find geometry that shames work being done at far larger and better resourced operations. Harvey Peace was never a large company. It was the kind of Sheffield workshop that employed skilled men who knew exactly what they were doing and took professional pride in the output in a way that is genuinely difficult to replicate at scale, which is exactly why so few people know the name. The company did not survive long enough to build the kind of brand recognition that crosses an ocean and persists through a century of change. It left behind tools instead, and those tools, when they surface at auction or in an estate lot, quietly demonstrate that some of the finest sawmaking ever done happened in a small workshop that most people reading about it today have never encountered. Number 5, Simons Manufacturing Company. Here is an American name that should be familiar to anyone who has spent serious time with vintage tools and largely is not, which says something interesting about how tool history gets written and who gets to write it. Simmons was founded in Fitchburg, Massachusetts in 1832, and at its peak it was one of the most important tool steel manufacturers in the country. The company made files, mill saws, circular saw blades, and hand saws, and the hand saw production in particular reflects a level of metallurgical knowledge that came directly from working at the industrial scale of producing precision cutting tools for the lumber and textile industries. When you know how to make a mill saw blade that can cut hardwood continuously for hours in a production environment, making a hand saw plate is a relatively straightforward application of that same knowledge. Simons hand saws from the late 19th and early 20th centuries carry that industrial heritage in the steel. The plates are consistent, properly tempered, and hold an edge in a way that reflects a company that understood steel from the inside out, rather than from the retail side in. The reason most people have never heard of Simons is simple. The company's consumer-facing presence was always secondary to its industrial work, so it never built the kind of household name recognition that Diston did through decades of aggressive retail marketing. The saws are just as good. The story is just quieter. Number 4, E.C. Atkins Silver Steel. Indianapolis, Indiana is not a city you typically associate with legendary hand tool production, but for a significant stretch of American manufacturing history, E.C. Atkins and Company was making some of the finest hand saws on the continent from a factory in the middle of the Midwest. Founded in 1855, the company grew into one of the largest saw manufacturers in the country and made its reputation on what it called silver steel, a proprietary alloy and treatment process that Atkins marketed as producing a superior plate. Whether the silver steel designation was a metallurgical reality or a marketing stroke of genius is a question that saw collectors still debate with genuine intensity. What is not debatable is what you find when you put a properly sharpened vintage Atkins on a piece of wood. The plate is thin, properly tapered, and remarkably responsive under the hand, the kind of saw that seems to almost find the line by itself when you are ripping a board to width or breaking down a rough-cut panel. Atkins was eventually absorbed into a larger company, and the brand disappeared the way so many great American manufacturing names did, not with a notable failure, but with a quiet acquisition and a gradual dilution, until there was nothing left worth keeping. What it left behind is sitting in tool chests and barn sales all across the country, underpriced because the badge does not ring the bell it should. This is a good moment to say something directly. If this kind of breakdown is useful to you, go ahead and hit subscribe, because this channel exists to cut through the noise and tell you what is actually worth your time and money. And if you are already wondering where to find these saws and what to look for when you are buying used, I put a guide together that covers exactly that. I will come back to it at the end. Number 3, Crown Hand Tools. Crown is a Sheffield company that is still in production right now, today, and almost nobody in the American market knows they exist. That invisibility is a genuine puzzle, because what Crown produces is exactly what a serious woodworker looking for a quality hand saw should want. The company makes saws with traditionally filed teeth, using Sheffield steel, with handles shaped from solid wood, in a factory that still employs people who understand the craft of saw making rather than just the mechanics of it. The prices are reasonable by the standard of what you are getting. The product is not being sold on a story about hand forging or artisanal heritage. It is just a properly made saw at a fair price, which sounds like it should be easy to find, and turns out to be surprisingly rare. Crown gets ignored in the American market for the same reason the other entries on this list get ignored. It does not advertise aggressively to American audiences. It does not show up in the publications and YouTube channels that American woodworkers follow. It sits in specialty catalogs and on import tool websites where the buyer has to already know to look for it. Once you find it and put one in your hands, the quality is immediately and completely self-evident. Number 2, Diston D12. If you know the Diston name, you know the D8, and we will get there in a moment. But the D12 is the saw that serious Diston collectors quietly argue might be the better tool for the majority of woodworking work that happens in a real shop. Where the D8 was built as a carpenter's workhorse designed for construction framing and rough dimension work, the D12 was aimed at the finish and joinery market, a saw intended for the woodworker who needed clean, controlled cuts in material that would be seen and touched when the job was done. The plate on the best D12 examples is thinner and more responsive than the D8, the tooth count slightly higher, the set a little less aggressive, all of it pointing toward a tool that was designed to leave a surface behind rather than just get through the material. In good condition with fresh sharpening, a D12 will produce a rip or crosscut that requires significantly less cleanup than what a modern disposable saw leaves behind. It is a tool that rewards a slower, more deliberate stroke and returns that patience in a surface that is genuinely close to finished. The D12 gets overlooked because the D8 got the mythology. That is a legacy of marketing, not of performance. And in woodworking, as in most things, the tool that earned the legend is not always the tool that earns the work. Number 1, the Diston D8. There was always going to be a Diston at the top of this list, and it was always going to be the D8. Henry Diston founded his company in Philadelphia in 1840 and built it into the dominant force in American saw manufacturing over the following decades through a combination of genuine metallurgical innovation, vertical integration, and an almost obsessive commitment to quality control that was not typical of industrial manufacturing in that era. At its peak, the Diston factory in Philadelphia was its own city within a city, with its own steel mill, its own file-making operation, its own handle-turning shop, and its own workforce of hundreds of people whose entire professional identity was wrapped up in making saws properly. The D8, produced across most of the 20th century, is the product of all of that accumulated knowledge expressed in a tool that costs $10 at a flea market and cuts like something that should cost far more. The plate is taper ground. The steel holds an edge. The handle, on the best examples in Apple or Beech fits a hand in a way that longer hours of use only confirms rather than questions. When collectors talk about the golden age of American hand tool manufacturing, the D8 is the measuring stick everything else gets held against. Not because it was the fanciest or the most expensive or the most limited in production. Because it was right, consistently for decade after decade, at a price that a working carpenter could actually pay. That is an achievement that sounds simple and turns out to be extraordinarily difficult to pull off, and the proof of it is sitting in tool chests all across this country, still cutting clean lines in wood a century after it was made. So, what do you do with all of this? You start looking at tool sales differently. You start reading the steel instead of reading the packaging. You start understanding that the hand saw hanging in a barn that nobody has touched in 20 years and costs $8 is a more interesting object than it appears, and that what stands between you and a life of clean cuts through good wood is very often 30 minutes with a saw file and the willingness to learn something your grandfather's generation considered completely basic. The modern tool market is not interested in that outcome. It is interested in selling you a replacement when the current one dulls. That is the business model, and it is rational from the manufacturer's perspective and consistently expensive from yours. Before we close, people always ask whether a saw sitting in storage for decades is worth buying or whether the years have done damage that makes restoration pointless. A neglected hand saw is almost always salvageable if the plate is free of serious pitting and the handle is structurally sound. Surface rust comes off, dull teeth get filed, a loose handle screw gets tightened. The things that actually ruin an old saw for good are deep pitting that has compromised the steel, a cracked handle beyond repair, and a kinked plate from being used as a pry bar. Short of those problems, what you have is a tool waiting to work again. The guide linked below covers how to evaluate a used saw before any money changes hands, what the real warning signs look like, and what the restoration process involves, from cleaning the plate all the way through, filing the teeth back to a proper cutting geometry. It is the information that turns a $10 barn find into the best saw in your shop. The link is in the description. These tools were built when making something poorly was a professional embarrassment rather than a supply chain optimization. The least we can do is find them, fix them, and put them back to work.